Let me start with a commercial interruption. This is the last for the next 50 minutes. I work for the NTSB, and at the NTSB, we're in charge of determining probable cause in accidents and making recommendations to improve safety in all modes. I'm working in the Office of Aviation Safety, and the NTSB, we're basically curious people. We like to try to figure out what happened and why, often to our own detriment. My wife still doesn't get over me asking her when she says that she's sick or has a cold, why? How did you get sick? I just don't learn that. But one of the things that I think all of us share is a deep passion to try to improve safety and keep accidents from happening again. Where there's about 400 of us, we're located in Washington, D.C., and we've got 5 politically appointed board members who serve 5-year terms. We don't have regulatory authority. We can't affect change directly, but through the thoroughness of our investigations, our safety recommendations, and advocacy, talking about our accidents like we're doing today, we can affect change and try to improve safety. One thing that Walt didn't mention in my bio was that several years ago, I was an early pioneer in the realm of cardboard aerodynamics, cardboard wing aerodynamics. That wasn't too successful, so I went off to school and got an education in human factors. I now find myself at the safety board, and this slide is to remind me to say that although the work that I'll be talking about today is from our investigators, the safety board investigators, and I'm a member of the safety board staff, the words that I'm going to say today are my own and not necessarily those of the agency. What I'd like to do in today's talk is survey accidents involving maneuvering phase of flight and discuss causal factors and prevention. In doing so, I'd like to we have 3 legs of our journey. The first leg, we're going to be talking about safety reductions when operating down low, hazards in that low altitude regimen of flight. Then we're going to move over to the airport and talk about maneuvering accidents that occurred in the airport traffic pattern. And then the last leg of this journey, we'll pull out of the airport pattern and start talking about decision-making and distractions that occur elsewhere in flight that lead to maneuvering flight loss of control accidents. I don't necessarily have all the answers. Walt called me an expert. I prefer to say I'm a specialist. I'm a student of human factors. And we rely on other pilots. We need to know what's going on. And so hopefully this seminar today will be a dialogue. We can share together, share information, share wisdom, and talk about accidents. One of the most important things when thinking about looking at an accident, it's all too easy to just dismiss an accident or a particular human's error as that was just a dumb pilot, a stupid pilot trick. We can't do that as investigators because that prevents us from understanding why the accident happened and, most importantly, trying to prevent the accident, the next one from happening. So we need to pull back and take on the mindset that none of the pilots that we'll be talking about today woke up that morning saying, today is the day that I'm going to destroy my airplane or destroy someone's property. Today is the day that I'm going to have an accident and injure myself, kill myself, or injure or kill someone else. So we need to step back and say, it made sense to these pilots at the time. Why did it make sense? And what can we do to prevent it from happening? With that preamble, let's begin. This is a maneuvering flight accident, a stereotypical accident that involves maneuvering, or an aspect of our industry that involves maneuvering, that is aerial spray application, a crop duster. And this accident occurred with a 2,300-hour commercial pilot, and he made a mistake. He struck unmarked wires during a turn to reverse direction. What's the biggest challenge for this type of operation? An operation in which the pilot, by necessity, as part of their job, has to operate down low. Well, the challenges involve detecting hazards, maintaining energy, and the concept is everything is happening very, very fast. There's a lot to pay attention to in that information-rich environment down low to the ground. This is another working pilot, a pipeline patrol pilot. This pilot, too, has to work close to the ground, a very challenging environment. The pilot here was inspecting a pipeline and was reversing direction around the tank farm there on the sectional chart. Was reversing direction, and it was your typical day, a broken overcast layer or shelved overcast layer, and as the pilot reversed direction and started heading back along the pipeline, he was making a climbing left-hand turn. The sun came out from under the shelf of clouds, momentarily got in his eyes. He's adjusting his sun visor. He's distracted from his primary task in terms of that climbing left-hand turn and struck a 320-foot tower along his route of flight. He didn't see it. He struck the tower. He survived. And you can see here, after the accident, he told the safety board as part of his write-up of the accident some issues here as far as the distractions and how it played a role. But he also discusses the concept of complacency and the challenge in dividing attention, as can be seen in this quote. He talks about the concept of a comfort zone, that we ease ourselves in to an area of operation where if nothing bad has happened to us before, we sort of continue operating along that path. And we don't necessarily see the risks that are right in front of us as we're doing those operations. So the onus for us is to try to sit forward on our seats when we fly. Not be scared, not be frightened, but to try to be vigilant and aware of the hazards that are in our operating environment and try to establish countermeasures to protect against them. In this case, you can mitigate risk through pre-planning the route, through identifying hazards along the flight path. In the case of that aerial spray applicator, they accept the risk as far as the potential for accidents, and that pilot walked away because of the aircraft structure, the roll cage, and so there are ways to mitigate risk if you have to operate down low, especially as part of the job in which you're flying. In this case, we'll again stay with the concept of a working pilot, and we will talk about an accident involving an instructional flight. Student pilot and a flight instructor who had 1,300 hours were doing a off-airport emergency landing drill, power out drill, and they got down to about 50 to 100 feet when they struck a wire. They originally thought it was a bird. They flew back to the airport. That's the damage to the vertical. So they came underneath the wire in their low approach doing the simulated engine out performance. Did they need to be down this low? The answer is no. I see a lot of shaking heads. What could they have done to have performed this maneuver in a safer manner? Basically restating, setting a floor altitude, setting an altitude where they're not going to descend below. The concept of planning, thinking the maneuver through before executing it, especially in an operation where they don't have to be operating that low to the ground. That helps increase the margin of safety. This next accident does not involve an instructional flight, is not involving a working pilot, but also resulted in a low altitude wire strike. We had a private pilot who was out dispersing remains from their father-in-law over a cemetery for a ceremony. And they struck wires while going across the cemetery. The window came in, they were slightly injured, but they were able to make it back to the airport. What could these pilots have done differently? Fly higher? The other concept is they could have chosen to, there may have been some involvement or some loss of focus or target fixation, per se, as a result of the fact that it was the father-in-law's ashes in the plane and it was the son-in-law who was doing the flight versus a third party. But the other concept would be ground reconnaissance. Actually, if you're going to do this, go down, assess the hazards. It's part of the pre-planning, the risk mitigation that needs to happen before. Our next accident involves a call for a pickup. And this doesn't involve a cell phone call from an airplane, but in this case we had a pilot who was out flying some passengers around, did not have a lot of experience, only 180 hours in the last 7 years, and not much time in the last 90 days. The question of carrying passengers aside, let's pull back and ask what happened. The call for pickup was actually a prearranged signal that the pilot had with his wife, where when he was done flying for the day, he was going to orbit the house a couple of times as a signal to his wife that he subsequently needed a ride to the airport. She then left the house, was driving down the road to go pick up her husband, and she noticed in her rearview mirror her husband's airplane in the rearview mirror. So he's low. She later saw the airplane nosedive into the ground. He struck wires 70 feet over the ground, over the road there, and was killed. Again, we've got a 44-year-old pilot, married, not a lot of experience, and this must have made sense to him at the time. But I think if I asked, does it make sense to this audience, I'm going to see nothing but shaking heads. No, it doesn't make sense. But what part of his training, education, or experience that he had did he miss having the appreciation for risk or hazards of operating in this environment? What we need to do as a community is try to figure out ways in our education programs, in our pilot training, and as peers to give pilots forethought or foresight to appreciate risk and change courses of events. This next crash, we were talking about a low-time pilot who snagged wires over a road. This is a higher-time pilot. This pilot had 4,400 hours, ATP rated, had previously flown for a regional airline and a cargo airline. And at 11 o'clock at night, over Interstate 81 in Virginia, snagged high-tension power lines crossing the road. What was going on here? And it's a very challenging task that he was doing, because what he was doing was he was talking on the cell phone to a friend who was driving in a car on the road on Interstate 81, and he was showing the friend in the car what the airplane looked like at night. When the friend, as you can see in this written statement, saw the airplane hit the wires, explode, and crash into the ground. It was a challenging divided attention task, but unlike the pipeline patrol that we talked about earlier, this pilot did not need to be down there. A more appropriate way to show a friend what your airplane looks like at night is not to fly over them while they're driving, while you're talking on the cell phone, but invite them to the airport. If they need to see it from the ground, do some pattern operations at night and bring them along if they want the ride. But it's impoverished visual conditions, and this was a more experienced pilot. Somewhere along the line, this pilot did not have that true appreciation for risk that operating at 11 o'clock at night, impoverished visual conditions, over a road at low altitude, and doing a divided attention task was something that may not need to be done. How did this airplane get here? It's a Byrne, and no, did not run off the end of the runway. This airplane actually it stalled. It was relatively low attitude impact, and the pilot and 4 passengers on board were killed. What was happening was a 4,700-hour private pilot was taking passengers up for a local flight, a sightseeing flight. There was a work team at a camp in Nevada at a ranch, and he was taking passengers up to overfly the local area during the day. When we talked to witnesses during this investigation, the witnesses were saying that the airplane was seen making 2 or 3 low passes over the working group, and the witnesses estimated the airspeeds to be around, or the altitude to be around 100 to 300 feet above the ground. They saw the airplane make a sudden steep pitch up, climbing left turn, approaching 90 degrees, and then sort of stalled out and crashed nose first into the ground. A GPS on board showed that the ground speed during some of these passes, these low altitude passes, was approaching 120 knots. One witness thought it was a crop duster, but in this case it wasn't a crop duster. This pilot did not need to be operating down that low. And a witness up on the mountain actually took some pictures of this airplane. So we weren't relying necessarily or exclusively on eyewitness testimony, but we had photo evidence of this airplane as it's moved across the valley floor there. And as you can see, if I zoom up that last picture, that airplane's only about 3 or 4 wingspans from the ground when it's doing its maneuvering. How do you prevent an accident like this? Don't go buzzing a work area. And is this a very good way to share general aviation with people who may not be necessarily familiar with general aviation? Yeah, it may have been all he had. But the other question I want to pose to the group is that climbing left-hand turn where he stalled out, would it make a difference if the reason for that aggressive climbing left-hand turn was a bird or a balloon or some other obstacle that he was trying to avoid? Would it make a difference in our assessment of whether this was a good idea to do or not, or whether this pilot really needed to be down there? And I'm seeing heads shaking no. And the reason is that the pilot is operating down low to the ground. There is very little margin for error. They did not afford themselves the ability to recover from surprise or anything unexpected happening in their task environment. Sometimes pilots, who survive accidents, actually will draw a diagram for us as far as the circumstances of the event. And in this case, what we have is a pilot here who was out doing a sightseeing flight. They're the only person in the airplane, and as they're returning to the airport, they saw a friend of theirs on the road while they were driving. But you see here, what happens is the airplane landed. Don't think that's a bat. I guess those are 2 dragonflies. But the airplane landed on a dirt road off airport, didn't get to the airport. Why did it land on the dirt road? Well, what we often don't see in these maps that pilots draw for us is statements like, where I hit the SUV. And again, we can laugh here, but the concept is this made sense to this pilot at this time. He saw the friend, and so he did a 180 turn, and he was going to do a strafing run, fly over his friend, as his friend was driving on that dirt road. He wound up putting his friend into the hospital, and that's the tire track of his left main gear as he went over the car. The gear fell off. He then came back around to land on that dirt road to check on his friend. Again, what would you think the age of this pilot might be? And that's the answer was 22, in the 20s, and that's the stereotypical response. We're thinking, okay, that's the young risk taker. That's the person that shouldn't know better. This pilot was actually 70. This pilot should have known better. And our challenge as a community is, how do we get in touch with pilots like this to say, you know, it's okay to look down, it's okay to see friends on the ground, but it's a lot safer to get to the airport, call your friend, or the next time you have a drink with your friend, to say, hey, I saw you on the air, I know where you were. Surprise them that you knew what they were up to because you saw them from the air, not necessarily have them see you or have this up close and personal contact. 70 years old. Now remember what we were all taught when we were private pilots, as far as when we're going through our flight training, when we're operating down low, when we're doing our ground reference maneuvers. Didn't we have a set of checklists that we go through? What were some of the things on that checklist, or one of the primary things before we started letting down to do our maneuvers? What was one of the things that we were supposed to do? Clear the area, and then what we would do. One of the things I was taught, clear the area, and then make sure you pick where you're going if something happens. Where's your outfield? Where are you going? You're letting down into an area so that you have an outfield. If something were to happen while you're doing your maneuvers, you know where you're going. Well, this pilot was out checking deer stands and orbiting, looking at the deer stands on his property, and noticed that his Piper Light Sport was starting to descend, had lost altitude. He didn't catch it, he didn't arrest it. When he tried to arrest it while it was happening, when he tried to arrest the power, or the descent, he applied power. There was no power to be had. The engine had frozen up, carburizing. He wound up stopping, and as you see in that bottom left-hand picture, when the airplane was recovered, put on a set of blocks, the engine ran quite fine. There was nothing wrong with the engine. But again, this pilot just didn't work through the basic checklist. Let's go back to that tower pilot who was talking about that comfort zone, that sense of complacency. This pilot clearly had a sense of complacency that they didn't need to clear the area. They didn't need to follow the checklist. Hey, we're going into a low power state. Maybe we need to apply carb heat to protect ourselves, to minimize or to mitigate the risks of the environment that we're starting to operate within. I'd be remiss if I didn't show, when we're talking about maneuvering accidents happening low to the ground, this famous accident involving Corey Lytle in the East River in New York. Don't need to belabor the point, but that was the route of flight from Teterboro, and we had a CFI in that plane that wasn't necessarily familiar with the local area. They hit the building about 332 feet up. And what was happening was they were making that left-hand turn to avoid the Class B airspace, and were making it in a downwind direction. So they were getting pushed as they're turning. And instead of accepting the concept of an altitude bust, climbing up or exceeding the limits of that airspace, they unfortunately hit the building. And the probable cause cited in this case, planning and judgment and experience of the pilots involved. Our accident reports for surviving pilots, they afford us an opportunity to hear from the pilots. How could they have prevented the accident from happening again? And here we have, do not fly low over objects. This accident could have been prevented by keeping my altitude higher, following regulations. All things that we've seen in these last few accidents. There's not much time to react when you're operating down low. And if you need to, the concept is, what's the plan? We need to plan and for ways that identify the hazards in advance and mitigate the risk that we're going to